Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. My name is Avery Muir. I am a junior here at the University of Alabama. I'm originally from Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm currently a CNIS ambassador, and I also work in our athletic department with our athletics communications office, working with the SIDs. Actually, I have a coworker over here. And so today we are talking about college sports and how we discuss college sports within sports media. So our panelists today, right here, we have Mr. Stephen Godfrey from the Washington Post. He's with the Washington Post as a columnist and a co-owner and co-host at the Split Zone Duo Network. His work has appeared in a variety of publications and sites, including Vox Media and Gannett. He is also an executive producer, writer, and host of the 2018 Vox Media documentary Foul Play. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee with his wife and 3 children and hates writing bios. Dr. Nicky Lewis is an associate professor at the University of Kentucky. Her program of research centers on social, psychological processes and effects of the mass media. Her current research projects include a content analysis of violent penalty plays in the NFL and an examination of website engagement as a result of large-scale health communication campaigns. Prior to academia, Dr. Lewis was a sports producer and training coordinator at several Cincinnati television stations. And then we also have Cole Price, who is the director for the Advantage Center and NIL partnerships with Crimson Tide SportsMarkeEng. Cole is the director of the Alabama NIL Advantage Center, serving a hand in the NIL structure for Alabama athletics since 2021. Prior to this, Cole was the director of trademark licensing for Alabama athletics from 2013 to 2020, and also worked for the Collegiate Licensing Company in Atlanta. During his career, he has managed relationships with over 650 licensed manufacturers and over 100 retailers. So thank you all for joining us. My opening question that I wanted to start with, so there's been a lot of changes that have happened in college athletics recently. The launch of NIL, conference realignment, and the rise of the transfer portal, just to name a few. Just recently, the National Labor Relations Board ruled that the men's basketball players at Dartmouth could vote to form a union. Thinking about all of these changes, what do you think will have the biggest impact on college athletics in the future? Stephen, we'll start with you.
Will have the biggest impact on college athletics in the future?
Yes.
We probably still don't know, to be totally honest. And I'm not trying to cop out of the question, but more than likely the evolution is moving at a pace in which we can't probably understand. I think a lot of people would say NIL, but in actuality, the labor market in college athletics has been sort of regulating itself off the table for years. So now that everything's above board, I know it feels different. It feels weird if you're a college sports fan, but in actuality, that stuff's been happening for a long time. I think we are moving towards a professionalization of college athletics that it's somewhat ironic to have this conversation at the University of Alabama because I think in a lot of ways in the last 20 years, this is sort of America's first professional college football program in so many ways. So this audience here is well acquainted with the power of football for good and for bad, but you're going to see this university and a handful of others kind of used as a blueprint in the future for those who can afford it.
Nicky?
Yeah, I mean, I look at it from 2 ways. First, from the fan. So how does restructuring from the conference level and moving from Power 5 to Power 2, which we'll talk about later, but this idea of how does that shape rivalries? How does that shape tradition? How does that shape the way that we see different rivalries across different conferences, and what does it mean for the nature of competition? So that's the first space that I look at, and I think that's going to change over the next several years. The other space that I'm thinking about is understanding kind of how I would say how are the sports that are not revenue generators, how are they left behind, right? So the mission of college sports and amateur athletics is to lift up sports that aren't revenue generators, and the direction that we're heading, as you mentioned, with professionalism and other avenues is very likely to kind of leave behind where the have-nots continue to not have and the haves keep getting bigger. So
Awesome. Cole?
Yeah, I mean, as I've thought about it, I think it's really amateurism is probably going to be the biggest step back for college sports, right? And really, in some ways, one might say that the tearing down and the restructuring of what that looks like. I'd challenge everybody to go take a look at how the NCAA got started when it was founded and why. It's a really interesting story in its history and what was going on between itself and the AAU. You had a bunch of competition that was occurring that was unregulated. You had, at that time, what they would call amateurs versus some professional athletes participating, people dying that were participating in certain sports, especially football. So when you look at that and kind of what came out of that to try and create what everyone called competitive balance, because we thought, hey, certain things were going to happen And so we needed to curtail that. That wasn't thought about in the line of these things are going to generate significant revenue in the future. And so what does that mean as the sport grows, gains publicity, generates all this revenue, and then you have participants that are called amateurs. And so I think that changed through the evolution of whether you want to call it NIL and kind of what that's looked like, or conference realignment and how decisions are getting made because of the growth of media and content. I think that's going to be the biggest shift that is going to best kind of formulate how this all progresses from here.
How many, this is almost all students in here, how many of you, just by show of hands, or you can yell if you want to, think that college athletes should be paid? Okay, most of you. And then those of you who raised your hands, how many of you think that, especially if you're a second or third or fourth generation Alabama, how many people think that the generation before you, like your parents or your uncles or aunts, would they agree? Okay. So your decision in the way that you're going to choose to consume sports and athletics is going to be the first of its kind, because you're going to accept something that's above board for the first time in college athletics. So a lot of these questions really hinge on, you're going to ask us stuff about what we think based on our experience. You guys are going to shape college athletics in a way that we don't understand yet. And the media has moved so fast in the last 25 years. I've been doing this for about 2 decades, and every 3 to 4 years, the format changes, right? Mm-hmm. It's embarrassing, but I'm 42 and I have to be on TikTok. It's just a very strange thing to say out loud, and I have to do that. But that's natural to you guys, right? You can tell a story in 6 seconds, 3 seconds, whatever. We had to learn how to do that. And so then in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to be better equipped with the format and the platform than we are, but you're still going to need to know how to tell a story efficiently.
Yeah, thank you. So, Stephen, this one is generally more directed for you, but then Cole and Nicky, you guys can obviously jump in as well. In the past 20 years, the way people consume sports media has drastically changed. From the sensationalist takes culture of ESPN's First Take and Fox's Undisputed to now where it seems like everyone has a podcast and gets their news through social media. What are some trends you've recently seen that continue to innovate how people consume media about their favorite teams and athletes? Is there anything that stands out to you given your connections through media?
Yeah, kind of what I just said earlier is basically the consumption pattern has changed dramatically in 25 years. And I think some of you are probably changing the way you're consuming your news in the 5 or 10 years maybe that you've been paying attention to this kind of stuff. And it's going to change again. So the constant now is the variable, which is that the means and the method by which you take information in is probably always going to change. But also, you guys, I think most of you are sort of media students, you're going to be creating this as well. So the speed at which you can adapt and understand is probably the biggest asset that you guys have. And that's something that, when I got into newspapers, I got in like the last 2 years, I feel like, and then it was dying. And then, all of a sudden advertising was gone. Mm-hmm. And then everything sort of fell. It was, we're going to work for venture capital funded .coms, and then they failed. That's part of the reason I started my own podcasting company, was to own it and was, to have some sort of stability. You guys, I think, could be the greatest generation in media that we've seen, because for 100-odd years, everything was the same. Everyone fought change, like aggressively fought change. And then everyone's been catching up ever since then. Whereas you guys are coming on at your age knowing that there's a constant change. You guys are adapting to new apps, new platforms, and it feels very organic to you guys. So as long as you can tell a story, it's going to be the same. As for like the takes culture, the podcast culture, I think we could probably debate. There are some ethical and editorial merits to this. I bet some of you, most of you in here are consuming some sort of media that is athlete created, right? So if you think about it, that's one thing that I've noticed in the last 5 or 6 years is there's a suspicion of the media. So what athletes are going to do is they're going to talk to other athletes on a podcast or conversation. That doesn't have the same rigor in terms of editorial standards that talking to the media does. The problem is the media did a bad job for 25 years in relationships with athletes and coaches. So there was a mistrust that sort of emerged there. And that's why athletes, that's why you want to talk to some ex-quarterback on a podcast, because he understands your plight better, but he's also not going to press you for information the same way.
Nicky, Cole?
Yeah, thinking a lot about what you said. I have a couple of ideas in thinking about this. So if you think about just one generation ago, the gatekeeping function that sports journalists had of limiting our access to athletes based on who had access to the locker room and then who could dissolve or distill that information for audiences. Athletes have been able within the last 10 years to bypass that gatekeeping function completely and present a version of themselves online and on social media that is unlike anything we've ever seen. And if you tie that to the hot take culture, now that we have more access to athletes than ever, everybody has an opinion. Well, which opinions are worth listening to? That's what we all as consumers have to deal with now, is wading through all of the opinions to determine which ones are of value. And that's where the gatekeeping and ethics come back in, is we need to rely on experts and professionals that have been trained to do this properly and to share that information. So that's one thing I think that's kind of coming full circle. The other part about it is working as a sports producer and a sports journalist. It's a tougher job than being a news reporter, because you not only have to report fairly on the negatives of the sport, but you also have to maintain quality relationships with coaches and management. So you're trying to forge good relationships to get that access while also doing investigative reporting on the negative sides of that. And I think it's a harder balance as a sports reporter or a sports producer to manage that, as opposed to being more of a traditional news person.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the accessibility and availability of things, right? You talk about what y'all have access to, but even go into rural parts of Alabama, go in across the country to rural parts, they might not have Wi-Fi at their house, but they got a cell phone and they have access. And so I think that shift with the media and the content consumption of what can be done, and I think there are two sides of it. I see more on the student athlete side when it comes down to then pressure, right? Maybe people don't have that about their personality, and yet they see all these things happening with others. And so how do I perform? How do I create those things when it's not in their wheelhouse and not something that really fits them as an individual? On the same front, you have a lot of student athletes that, because of what's happened from what I work with every day, they're becoming celebrities, and it has nothing to do with sport. It really doesn't. Like, that's become an additional platform. There's so many other things. And so I think as we look at that, and definitely what you guys have shared, I mean, when you get in the opinion space, we've seen it here. If you've been here a couple years, and the stories that have happened around Alabama the last few years of where opinion has come out super strong on topics and the facts have not been anywhere close to it, those things are really challenging for all fronts. And I think how that is student athletes, but also on the athletics front of how those messages are going to be managed. Yesterday our football staff, had a group that's, a media group in Birmingham in their offices for the day. Right? That's a totally different play to create that access and create that availability for people to have insight. And so I think there's a lot to be gained there, and a lot that can be taken in a good direction, while also protecting, the flip side of, hey, making sure what's being consumed is appropriate, is backed up by fact, is reaching the right people in the right way.
If you are an undergrad here right now and you want to work in sports media, and you have, you're going to be here for the next 2 or 3 years, you have access to one of the most interesting stories of the last 30 years in college sports, college football specifically, because you just saw the end of something that was completely unprecedented. So what happens next at this university is fascinating to me. I mean, you guys have access to that on a ground level, what that's going to look like, what the University of Alabama is pre and post Nick Saban. I hate this, you guys are too young enough to understand, it was a completely different place. What was built here, and the reason why I asked before we went on the air, how many of you guys are from out of state, how many of you are from far out of state, that was built by the football culture. The New York Times came in and and I think the Wall Street Journal as well, did a huge piece on that front door aspect of athletics and football, and there was never anything as consistent as Alabama football in the history of college football. And now that's over. You went through a period of over a decade where one program was guaranteed to be in the national title game 1 out of every 1.76 seasons. That's insane. Chances are that next coach is probably not going to do that. I hate to break your heart. But how you guys respond and how the culture reacts to that, you have access to all this. Are we? We're like physically in the stadium right now, technically, or something like that. So yeah. So use that to your advantage.
Awesome. Well, Cole, I want to jump back to you. A big focus today among student athletes in the era of NIL is building their personal brand. Athletes want to go to schools that will allow them to maximize their personal branding opportunities. What are some ways you think this trend will impact the recruitment of prospective student athletes? And do you think some other elements of recruiting are going to lose their importance to make way for personal branding?
Yeah, I mean, in short, no, I don't think, going to the last question, that recruiting's not going to be shifted in any way or other aspects will be diminished, especially with what's been built here and developed. There's so much from that standpoint that stands out. When prospects come in to look at Alabama, with the personal branding side, it's interesting, right? You have to kind of come back to time. There's a level of focus, there's a level of intentionality that a prospective student athlete is coming to Alabama to come to school and participate in sport. And so where that fits in for them comes down to really a couple questions. We have our student athletes that have a professional route that they can go for the sport. And so they have a certain drive, a certain way that they have to be to excel and to reach that potential. And so, you look at that group and you say, okay, they have to think about this in terms of, if they make it, which is a low percentage, but when they do, networking, not just outside of the sport with business investments, but other things that, hey, when they go out there and NIL, like, they can learn a lot now that's going to help them significantly in the future to make sure the things that have happened historically of a kid going pro and being bankrupt so many years outside of the league, hey, that those things are changed now. And they may happen in the future, but they're going to be such an anomaly because of the preparation. And that, hey, those student athletes have a really different structure than all you do as individual students, right? There are a lot of opportunities that y'all have and can go do because of the time and because, hey, you're here to get a degree and that's your main thing. And so you get to do internships and some of those things where that's always been a challenge for them on their front because on their end, their sport takes up so much time and all the other things with it. And so I think as we look at that group, it's really interesting. On the other side, we have a slew of student athletes that there is no professional aspect for them. So they're getting to think, hey, like, how do I excel at my sport? But I have this side time where when I leave school, I'm not just thinking about the degree, which is a great part, and getting a job and a singular focus. I'm kind of thinking like, hey, how do I build this personal brand with Alabama so that when I'm done, I don't have one income stream. I have 1, 2, 3, 4 of whatever I want to create. And so how do I use the time now to do all those things to best position myself when I leave here, which is more similar to what, a regular student would be going through. So I think as like student athletes think about that and how Alabama has the resources to help provide for that. I mean, that's really what I see, from my perspective of my job and role. We make sure the brand partner has a great experience with working with student athletes and in partnership with the Alabama brand and what that looks like for their business. On the flip side, it's protecting that experience a student athlete has. We have 650 student athletes. They're all very different. If we can protect the experience each one has with whatever that's going to be, then that's going to look forward. And when a prospect comes in and they say, hey, how's Alabama been? How have things been going? They can look and say, hey, like, I've had all the support I could need. Just in the same way that y'all have that support in the college here and by your professors and the people that help you make that progress through school so that, hey, when you're done, you're going to have your best foot forward. So I think as, we look at those things of how personal branding and really student athletes gauging that for themselves. One of my favorite questions has been times I meet with parents and sit down and say, you might hear different things or they've talked about different things on other trips they've been on, and then they tell you something. You're like, well, how much time do you want your child really spending on any of this? And it's usually such a great level set because it brings back to reality. Hey, like, there's a main thing here of academics and athletics, and where everything else needs a fit is going to be something that is strategic and keeping that focus.
No, you go ahead.
Whoever's ready, go for it.
Brand management is something, again, I think generation, the student athletes that I'm sure you're seeing now are probably more adept at that because you guys have all been managing your brands for years. You guys know how to do that. You know how to cultivate that. I was in a production meeting in Los Angeles with a television producer who had no knowledge of the SEC whatsoever. And you know what they brought up? Bama Rush Talk. Which, by the way, if you want me to do my outfit, I can, if you guys. That became a universal, that was totally organic, right? And that became something that sort of lived virally. But that's brand management. It's all part of it, right? Dude, right here, you have the Lank sweatshirt on, right? Like, that's totally organic. That's brand management. That's something that I think like 16, 15, even 14-year-olds are starting to be cognizant of in athletics.
Yeah.
Which is a positive ultimately because it's something that you can control.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's you're organically building skill sets based on the media environment that you're surrounded by. And so I think there's something to be said for, the focus is obviously academics and athletics, but there's so much more knowledge that can come outside of the classroom, outside of the traditional degree structure, based on these experiences that you're describing and the ones that you're describing as well. So if it's not, part of your course curriculum and on your degree, that's okay. It's about kind of building those additional revenue streams, building those skill sets, understanding what is appealing to audiences based on what you can do. And I think that's where athletes can take some of the control back from kind of the structure of the NCAA and the pressures put on practice schedules and study tables and all of the things that you're required to do. It gives the athletes some agency back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's the most practical thing that's ever happened, right? And to your point earlier, Steve, like, it's not new either. It's just new for this unique group of people that had a certain structure around it. So I think y'all can take the same things from your perspective as students of like, hey, like, in the same way it's this for athletes and there's all this conversation about it. Well, technically students have had that right forever. And so it's a great reminder of like, hey, like, how do I think about that for myself? What would that look like if I took the same advantages however I can?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. So, Nicky, a lot of the recent moves in college athletics have been made with football and men's basketball in mind, with little to no thought for non-revenue sports. What are some side effects or additional unintended consequences from these moves that you foresee impacting smaller sports on college campuses, specifically with women's athletics and Olympic sports?
Yeah, so when we first started the panel, this idea of NIL being a great thing in a lot of ways, but also creating that separation of the revenue generators and the non-revenue generators, making that gap even wider. Because there's a couple of things I think going on with the NIL piece. One of them is that although we thought it was going to create a more equal playing ground for women athletes and non-revenue generating athletes, pretty much we're seeing more of the same of the football and men's basketball players getting the bulk of the NIL endorsements. And so it requires these non-revenue generator athletes to work even harder to get their brand out there. And also too, this idea that traditionally there's not a path to being a professional athlete for a lot of non-revenue generating sports. So for those that do play men's basketball or football, even though it's less than 2%, we know the percentage is super small of folks that go pro, you still have the opportunity to be on a much more visible stage to present a version of yourself. And professional opportunities for the non-revenue generators, I think, are obviously lacking. And I think if you look at the Olympic side of things, the college campus is the feeder ground for many of our Olympic sports, track and field, swimming and diving, wrestling. Those are all at risk of being cut or modified or busted down to club status if we continue to see the dominance of men's basketball and football. And then finally, the Title IX argument, which is the elephant in the room. Most schools are not in compliance with Title IX, nor have they really ever been, but federal funding has never been taken away. So Title IX, in a lot of ways, is just kind of a good faith effort that's never really been enforced. And with opportunities like NIL, I don't see that closing the gap necessarily. Those are my general thoughts, yeah.
It's going to come down to what we tolerate, right? It's about what you are going to put up with as a consumer of the sports, of these sports, not just one sport. I mean, it's everything. Everything we can discuss here has probably been at play 20, 30, 40 years, depending on the topic. It's what are we willing to stomach? So, that's why I asked the question earlier about, do you think a football player should be paid, especially at a place like University of Alabama? I mean, not maybe this building, but That stadium exists in large part to deplete the funds of an athletic department because the business model for 20, 30 odd years, there was a Supreme Court case in 1985 that changed everything. If you learn one thing today, it's that some people at the University of Oklahoma figured out that the NCAA should not control who goes on television and who doesn't in football. So believe it or not, even in 1985, there were only like 3 or 4 games on television, and the schools had no say in that. The conferences had no say in that. It's kind of insane to think about now with conference networks. They went all the way to the Supreme Court, they won, and then all of a sudden the money faucet turned on. And ever since then, so roughly 40 odd years, it's been a race to deplete those funds at the university level to then turn your pockets inside out and say, well, we don't have money to pay athletes. We don't have money to fund this. There's absolutely no reason we can't have, we can't be in cooperation with Title IX, for instance.
Right.
So for however long we tolerated that was as long as they could get away with it, essentially. And finally, it was so absurd to look at these billion-dollar industries and these hundreds of $million facilities. This university was famous colloquially in sports media because they put holograms in waterfalls for the athletes. When I say athletes,
For the football players.
when I say athletes, what am I talking about?
Yep.
Right? Your tolerance of this will dictate how much they quote unquote get away with as we move forward. So one of the beauties of the way media works now is that there is so much more transparency. It's not vetted. The editorial standards are shaky sometimes. It's really, really, really hard for a sports information department, even at Alabama, to regulate every athlete and every student with a cell phone. It's just, you can't do it. You used to be able to coddle and keep out maybe 10, 12 reporters. The transparency now is almost impossible to stop. And so the standard changes because there's more information available. So it really comes down to what are the majority of sports fans and what are the majority of media okay with in terms of the structure? Because some of the things that we're discussing here, they've been around forever. We just either we didn't know about it or people just kind of shrugged at it. So that's why I always throw it back on your generation. You guys in the next 20 years are going to figure out what are we going to accept in college sports. You're going to answer the question for us.
Great answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think to y'all's points, I mean, at the end of the day, right now, for a lot of those sports, like college is the professional. And so I think in the content creation and the growth we're seeing in what the media is going to do and the networks are going to do, especially because of men's or football and men's basketball, potentially some other sports, I think there's an opportunity for significant growth. I think, some of those sports right now on the female side are really where football was 30, 40 years ago. Like that's where they were at. And so I think it is going to be to some degree a divergent part that whatever it looks like. But I also think there's an opportunity too, in addition to the content, the professionalization that, pro sports can come and should come along for those and get more developed, but it's going to take 20, 30 years for the branding of that to kind of reach the consumer and build up enough equity, whereas college has been building that for 100 years, and those sports are able to graph off the total. And so I think where those are able to remain, I think they will change from a conference structure standpoint. So I think it'll turn more regional. I think a lot of the conversation right now with conference realignment, where you talk about, some of those student athletes flying cross country for soccer matches or some of those things, that might happen for a small period of time. That is not going to exist long. And one would say because of the money. In another way, hey, by regionalizing things in those sports, creating more equity there, I think there's more power and growth that better reaches a national stage and keeps growing that for those sports that are already having success because of the college brands. And so I think there is opportunity there for the right development to take place. And to y'all's points, yes, consumer, but I think networks, true, will have a big say in making sure. I mean, if they're willing to put, ESPN Ocho on or darts or some of the other random things you'll see on networks, I mean, these female sports now are definitely, light years above better than that in terms of reach and people paying attention. And so I think that will be a really cool thing to see, and then it'll lead back to, in each kind of situation's right mix, what that value looks like. and then how that's able to be grown and developed and matured as we move forward. And so that'll change. It'll look different. It won't look like college athletics over the last 40 years, but I don't think all of that is bad. I think it will be better attributed to those things where they can exist in the right way.
If any of you started a women's college basketball podcast tomorrow and you got a sizable audience, I would hire you. It is the fastest growing audience, and everyone finally caught up. Because it was an acceptable form of misogyny up until very recently to say there's no audience for this. There's no audience for this.
They didn't invest production into it.
Right.
They wouldn't send in the best graphics packages, the best cameras, the best producers, the best directors. So
Well, look what happened in Nebraska. They had, their whole football stadium filled up for a volleyball match.
Yes.
And those things are, the attention's there. We see it with a number of our teams between gymnastics and what they're able to house in Coleman. Our softball team sells out their stadium, is the largest annual attendance for a softball team in the country. I mean, those things are, those fan bases are very proud, and they're, when you get in that environment, and to say it's a little bit more collegial because it's again like football was 30, 40 years ago. Yeah, you're walking up to the fence and talking to the student athlete. You have so much more access at this point with those things on top of it. It really creates a great environment.
Yeah, but I mean, if you are interested in women's basketball right now, you start a podcast, which has basically virtually no overhead, right? In terms of equipment, time, etc. You build a small audience, I will hire you. Because corporate America now is looking at a situation where they're like, we need to allot X amount of money to women's sports. We see growth potential there. And that's not a moral thing.
no, it's just a fact.
Corporate America doesn't work morally.
Yeah, they don't owe us anything.
They are going to invest in where they see a growth market. And so one positive is I do think all of the splintering of media has allowed for something like women's sports to finally get up, sort of find some sort of audience and community and build it. And that kind of happens more with social media, I think, organically than it does by the traditional, the traditional platforms, the traditional methods.
I would also argue that, as he mentioned, this idea of only being NIL focused or branding based on the sport. No, there's other attributes. There's health, there's fitness, there's beauty, there's all of these different sub areas that you can become a marketer or an ambassador for.
Yeah,
right?
Definitely.
No slight to the males, but I mean, I think everyone would be very honest that females are 10 to 1 better of just thinking about social media and how to utilize it and how to talk to a screen. I mean, just all those things that come very natural.
Yeah.
Thank you. So the SEC and Big Ten recently announced their strategic partnership. In your opinion, do you think we're moving to a world of more of a Power 2 conference system as opposed to the traditional Power 5 that we've previously seen? Do you think major conferences such as the ACC and Big 12 might get left behind?
So
You want me to do it?
I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's funny. Like, I think back on my career and when I got out of school, first job, 2010, right before kind of the first big realignment happened, my generation, like we were sitting there and like we were all talking about it. Like you could see it. It was so clear. You just didn't know how it was all going to happen. We were joking around at that time of like, what makes sense is 4 conferences, your championship games, start the playoff, and it goes straight into it. I think now what you've got is probably how bowls are to some degree, rolling into the playoff, right? The key ones, they're not going away. They're kind of coming up underneath it. I would see the same thing from a conference standpoint. However it takes shape and whatever you want to call it, if it is 2 big headings, other ones are going to roll underneath, right? So they might be a category of it to keep those brands relevant from a recognition standpoint. But in terms of the real foundation and setup, it's going to happen and come to a fruition because, it's really becoming the reality that we've all seen for a long time now of, all right, standards have been set, competition is what it is. The players that are in it, like, there needs to be more formalized to have that real great competition exist. And then everybody else, hey, like the remainder with 1AA or whatever, like they can go have their own playoff and that competition is going to get that much better too. So I think getting out of this world we've lived in of, what's really not true, that everyone has the opportunity, like in men's basketball, that's different. But for football, it's going to be unique, and that's going to be the driver of that conference part. And again, going back to women's sports, I think that's where you see a different shift. You know, there might still be an SEC, Big Ten play there, but you could see some other shifts of other conferences being created just around women's sports potentially. Because right now, like, we have a rowing program. They don't participate in the SEC. They participate in the Big 12. No one cares or knows about that at this point, but I think as structure changes and gets repositioned, that's another way that could happen too that would be beneficial on that side.
All right, this is just me saying this.
I thought all this was
I'm really close to Birmingham, so there's like a red dot in my chest in a second. The SEC is not going to exist in 30 years. Okay, it may not exist in 20. The same with the Big Ten. We are moving towards what has been coined the Super League. If you just talk about revenue-driven sports for a second, so let's just talk about football too, because basketball doesn't actually draw on the same level as football. It's not even close. There are about 7 or 8 brands in basketball that are considered sort of nationally viable, and then after that, the drop is precipitous. The revenue does not match. Okay? There is no cultural component that ties Oregon and Rutgers. There's no cultural component on any academic level, on any cultural level, on anything, any of the emotional equity that college sports feeds on, right? Because you don't just like I'm an Atlanta Falcons fan, which is just a bad life choice, but if you're an NFL fan, you might have some sort of emotional or family tie to it, but not the way you do at college, right? Not down here in the South, right? This is where your parents went to school and, oh, I got engaged here and all this kind of stuff, right? That's what they fed upon for years. But they're trading on it simultaneously because they're trying to concentrate money and concentrate money and concentrate money. So now, what in the world does Oklahoma have in common with South Carolina? We're gonna do this for the next 10 years and act like it just means more and, oh, we're all the same? Have you all been to Missouri? What does Missouri have in common with Ole Miss or Mississippi State? I should say State. Okay, we're going to keep doing this. We're going to keep doing this, okay? So it's weirdly controversial to say right now because in the media, so we are at the behest of access still, especially at my level. I just don't care anymore because I get to be a columnist. There's nothing that defines these conferences that's going to last in the next decade or two. I don't even understand why this is so controversial. It's just inevitable. So in other words, what joined Alabama and Auburn and Georgia and Ole Miss together 50 years ago? You guys can probably like fire off a bunch of answers, right? You're local, it's cultural, you have the same like-minded, roughly state legislatures are the same, you get maybe some ag schools, et cetera, so forth, right? That's what joined the Ivies together, that's what joined the HBCUs together, right? We're taking all that away because there's more revenue in the carrier, which right now is television, which, by the way, we were talking about this before we went on. I have a 6-year-old who loves the NFL. He does not watch football the way we watch football. He gets on the YouTube TV package and watches like a 7-minute condensed version of the game afterwards, and he looks at me like an idiot for watching it live. So all this is going to change, okay? All this is going to change. Eventually, Alabama is going to look around and go, we used to have the most in common with Georgia and Ole Miss and South Carolina and all these schools. South Carolina is a bad example because they only got here in '92. But eventually, what Alabama should realize, if we continue along this path of being a business, is that we have more in common with Ohio State. And we have more in common with USC. And that's what's going to happen. And so this idea that the SEC is infallible and perfect and powerful, and the same with the Big Ten, they've already written their own obituary. They just don't know it yet. Because eventually these individual schools who were once taught that regionalization and the power together was the most, that was it. That was the thing, because it did just mean more culturally, and we could sell that block. When Alabama has more in common with Michigan, Ohio State, USC, Miami maybe, what's going to happen? They're all going to get together. So you'll have 40 schools, 45, 50 schools maybe. I think the cut goes down to somewhere around 36 in your lifetime. Maybe mine, I'm not planning on going anywhere, but in the next 20 to 30 years, you're going to see a schedule where Alabama is going to play. And this is just in football, because everything that you guys have said about non-revenue sports, it just simply can't comply.
Right.
Like the rowing team, or the Chip Kelly, right before he left UCLA to go to Ohio State, he was like, why are we doing this? Why we have an acclaimed women's volleyball program that turns out Olympians. And so why are they going to Purdue now? And nobody asked that question, right? The only thing we care about is what's going to be on football in the fall, right? So eventually Alabama is going to look around, and they'll probably do it with Georgia, and they'll probably do it with I would say 4 or 5 institutions like Texas, right? Perpetually rich. A&M perpetually rich, whether they, as many bad decisions as they can make, they still, that's oil. They're going to look around and go, all right, let's just make a 40-team league. And that will be the end of the idea of college sports as amateur.
Yeah, to me that reads as eventually it will become like the men's basketball Final Four tournament, where fan cultures related to conference are going to be left behind, and the networks and this 40 to 50 supergroup is going to rely on fans adapting to letting Purdue, Indiana go, letting Duke, North Carolina go.
Oh, definitely.
Let those go. Region doesn't matter. Culture doesn't matter. It's all about the competition on game day, right? And so that's where I think, to me, it reads very similar to what we saw with the rise of fantasy sports, where we stopped caring as much about teams and more about individual athlete performance and using people as commodities to perform. This reads a very similar metaphor to that, I think.
And if Auburn doesn't get it together, why would you stay with them?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, competition's king. I mean, that's for sure. I mean, that no consumer is seeking that deeply about the history of things, especially this next generation coming up, that just as we look at this crowd, you got 60% out of state here, but the number of students from the state of Alabama has remained primarily flat. All the growth's been out of state. So even your community here has shifted from a national landscape, right? Not just where we're recruiting student athletes from on top of it. So, I kind of rival some of that a little bit of where the conference power goes because of what the culture is of the sport in totality, not necessarily the regionalization that it was built from. But yeah, I mean, I agree that, like, hey, at the end of the day, you're going to get to that, super football league, whatever. However, some teams are going to remain it because you do need some level of
structure.
Yes, and some count it winnable games, right? And
they'll definitely, I mean, I think in 2045 they're going to schedule South Carolina here because it's going to be a win for sure. Right. But that's going to be the limit of it for sure. Yeah, I mean, there's no reason to do anything other than that. You're going to have a 7-9 game schedule. Also, the amount of games is going to expand until the absolute limit, and the absolute limit is going to be some sort of player organization. College athletes are going to have to, the dirty U word, unionize in some capacity because they will stretch the amount of inventory, which just means football games. And remember, it's a 2.7 second car wreck every play. If you've ever stood on the field, that's what it is. We love it. It built our culture. Let's just be honest about it. So they're going to stretch that and build that until someone says this is the limit. So that's another thing to consider.
All right, so we have about 10 minutes to take audience questions. If anyone has anything they would like to ask, we'll start right here.
Thanks for the panel. The notion of tolerance came up a lot. And as I think about these super conferences, I'm Michigan State grad, Syracuse now, from Missouri, so the only person with their hand up. A lot I'm missing from Missouri. But in these super conferences, these brands got to be used to lose. And our fans going to accept that, when you join a 40-team super conference, you're not going 12-0 anymore.
It depends on what the postseason structure is, though.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. So I'd love to hear your notes on that.
Yeah.
I think you're already there.
The 12-team playoff doesn't exist to help
Cincinnati or Boise State.
Yeah, Texas, San Antonio has a great season. No, don't kid yourself. The 12-team playoff was only approved, and by the way, was just reformulated 2 weeks ago to the 5-7 format. That's just to help more power schools. The definition of a successful season now, to basketball's point, is going to be determined by whether or not you made the playoff.
Well, and by determining the structure in a more finite way, it does shrink the funnel of where the top talent's going to go, right? So, more people in that group are going to have all the talent, and then there's going to be better competition, which is what everybody wants, which will lead to more inconsistent play because everyone's good, right? In the same way that you look at that in the NFL. That's just the natural move of where it's at. It's already going to start happening. And I think if you go back and listen, especially this last season, to what different coaches around the country were saying about their teams, how they were speaking about them, how they were talking about games that they won or lost, especially close games, they're already preparing the fan base for that reality. It is very clear. Because, yeah, you're about to live in a world just like we experienced this past season with Texas. Week 2, you lose, well, but you're not done. And I think it's going to be a relieving thing once fans get used to it because of what they have to get out of living through the last 20 years where that didn't exist. Like, it was one and done in a lot of ways.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that is that what you will see, it kind of actually reminds me of when the Marlins went to the World Series a couple of times with a bunch of names that nobody knew, right? And the idea is that I think that players that you said that funnel's going to reduce, some players will get tired of being second or third in line, and they'll go to one of those mid schools, a Cincinnati or a UCF or something that will make a burst every now and again.
Sure.
But you're still going to have the dominant players every year in and year out.
Especially if they get paid well.
Exactly.
Right?
The question too is, I think we all agree that that athletes should be paid. Many of you raised your hands, but the question for your generation, as you mentioned, is at what rate? What do football players make compared to women's rowers, compared to tennis players, compared to volleyball players? And so there's a great moral kind of push to that idea, but your generation in application is the challenge, right?
The NCAA has also not only done nothing, but fought the very idea because it threatened their core business model for 50 years. And so now we're left with this totally unregulated, insane market where NIL structures are completely different school to school, and we don't have any guiding principles. And I think most people would agree here at Alabama or major institutions, they would love some guidance on this issue, right? If there's a salary cap, like Bama's going to hit it, right? Because there's enough support in this community to do that. There's enough support at Michigan to do that. The problem is there's no one's actually in charge. And it's been that way for years because the moment they lost that Supreme Court case, 9-0 against Alston, like that was it. They were
lost
broken.
their regulation power.
Yeah, and we're we were joking about this last night. I mean, it's post-Soviet Russia. Like the wall is down.
It's the Wild
No
West.
one knows how to regulate any of this business.
Right.
I'm sure you guys don't want to get in trouble with like at NIL in Alabama. No one's trying to get in trouble right now.
Right.
But there's also so little guidance and so little acceptance. Like if you go through the Tennessee case right now, it's very hard to figure out where they actually broke the rule by the standard, because a lot of that's going to change here soon. Which is also,
I mean, there's some things that are still clear. There's still a couple expectations that everyone should be abiding by, versus what NIL really truly is, right? And I think that's been the problem of, because of the lack of definition to guardrail that, it's allowed bad actors on the front to push aside that should have never been pushed. But because the lack of structure, that's been enabled at this point that everyone wants the guidance to help kind of curtail.
It's also really weird that we're asking people to pay for their player. For like, if you're a Yankees fan and they're like, hey man, give me $20, we got to get a better pitcher. That's a pretty weird prospect. That we're living in a very unique time, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're not asking the university to do this yet, because we're not actually paying players, by the way. So we're in this sort of in-between time that I think culturally, I think people are going to look back at this and think like, wow, this was a major transition period.
Any other audience questions?
There was a story that came out on ESPN yesterday that apparently there are chancellors and presidents within both the SEC and Big Ten that are starting to question their membership with the NCAA. Do you think we see a future where the NCAA starts to lose schools and then eventually those entire conferences as we move kind of towards that Super League you were talking about?
Yes. I mean, yeah.
I mean, the NCAA was founded to protect and support student athletes. Have they ever really truly done that?
It was founded to stop something called the flying wedge, and which was a football formation that was actually killing people, but we also didn't really have like helmets or pads. It was a very different game. And then ever since then, it's basically just been a shell company of a shell company to protect television contract money. And yeah, for those of you who don't know, when the basketball tournaments are played, all that money goes to the NCAA. Whereas like when football postseason, that actually exists outside of the NCAA in revenue. So I guess that's one thing we can thank the Bowls for.
Yeah.
So yes, the short answer is yes.
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen to it. I mean, what do you imagine? What kind of conversations are you having about it?
Yeah, I it's going to be interesting to see this next year play out. I think a lot is going to occur the most structure yet, which is not saying a whole lot. But I think it will play out in how everybody now understands that much better what happened 2.5 years ago, and where the sport needs to be developed. And it definitely could be a new entity outside of that. But at the end of the day, the main thing the NCAA is fighting for is antitrust protection, because they feel like if they make a decision, they're just going to get sued now either way it goes. So whatever the entity has to be, you're still going to need that protection, because you're going to set, again, guardrails, whether you get into collective bargaining, whatever you want to call it from a employee definition standpoint. I mean, we don't know yet. There's so much on the table that, again, kind of reference was made out something else. You got a bunch of people in a room in coats making decisions, and they know a lot, but at the end of the day, they're not mind readers either, and they can't see all the angles. So it's going to take some time to flesh that out.
I think schools like Bama should probably be with other like-minded schools in developing regulation and guidelines. I mean, the idea that Louisiana Monroe and Alabama should be regulated the same way, it just seems contrarian.
Yeah.
But yeah. Now, the NCAA exists specifically to protect a business model that doesn't exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, when they were created, right? I mean, it was them and the YMCA and AAU.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the reason they formed was so that, the schools that joined the NCAA would have the opportunity to play Yale and Princeton.
Yep.
And
Access.
so, yeah, it's all competition and garnering that now to some degree has spilled over to the conference side of where they're coming from and being able to establish it. So.
And they spent 30 years investigating people getting free rental cars or getting $500 from a booster. But when there was a spate of sexual assaults that were proven in court at Baylor, they threw their hands up and said, we don't enforce that.
Yep.
So where are your priorities at? Why they're going extinct should be pretty apparent.
All right, we've got time for one more question from the audience.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a PhD student here, and I've been looking at NIL, and I'm writing a paper on it and its effect on Title IX. About a month ago, the New York Times came out with an investigation of the Texas collectives, where they are recruiting a student from up north, paying him $750,000 a year to post once for some charity that one of the boosters are running. And now we have this ruling with the Tennessee judge that is basically saying that the NCAA can't enforce or punish these collectives. And I know we talked about all this stuff, and I know the answer is probably going to be the gap is widening. And while we do have the gymnastics here is incredible, tickets are very low. And so I'm wondering, now we're into litigation, and this is going to go back and forth, and I can't see it being anything other than a mess, and even bigger mess for women's sports.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, something that I've been looking at NIL and kind of mapping it onto is how sports betting became legalized state by state, and it's still being worked out as far as how the regulations are being applied, and it's all in litigation. But it's that same just slow burn where it's going to take years to figure out how these collectives are going to be managed or how they're going to be monitored. And again, thinking about like-minded schools finding each other as opposed to conference structure, that I think could be a path forward to start protecting women's sports and protecting non-revenue generating sports as a goodwill gesture to support the amateurism mission of, I think, is still important on many college campuses. But yeah, I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, because it's going to be happening all over the country in different spaces, and it's going to kind of bubble to the surface until, once again, the new generation takes. What are they willing to tolerate? We're back to.
I mean, the good news is, in a weird way, the rising tide floats all boats, and I do think you'll see technically more revenue towards female athletes at the collegiate level than we've ever seen before, which was zero before then. It will probably be disproportionate for a very, very long time.
If not always.
Yeah. To some degree, though, what you're talking about with the Texas incident, that's existed forever. Those are no-show jobs. The mob invented that, and it's a really good way to like rig capitalism. I mean, but it's happened in college sports for years. Adrian Peterson, who played for the Vikings, Rhett Bomar they were quarterback, running back tandem at Oklahoma. This is 20 years ago. They worked at a car dealership in Dallas in the summer. So that's existed for a long time. I'm not sort of giving you a moral judgment on that, but I think as it relates to women's sports is that beast is always going to be out there. And I think it's more incumbent upon women's sports to honestly maybe take some autonomy, and maybe like if there are like-minded programs within volleyball, basketball, softball, like softball is another one we haven't discussed that has a following, and it actually has proven to be a rating success for ESPN because they honestly they stamped down and they said, all right, Oklahoma City is going to be an event. Yep. We're going to put something behind it. I think that. Weirdly, I would focus more on the positives with women's sports right now. There's always going to be choose my language carefully, a storm outside of with the high revenue sports. But I think we're finally seeing a foothold and traction for women's sports. So if you silo it, it looks positive, which is certainly one vantage point to take. It's not the best one.
But at the end of the day, too, it's college is just a microcosm of the overall culture. It wasn't college that created that situation. It's not any different between the WNBA and the NBA at this point. So, the way I view it is, going back to like true NIL, it's the greatest opportunity a female student athlete's ever had. And when it's infiltrating high school and how all that's going to look across the country, I mean, again, you're going down the line to which this blows my mind of like minors and parents that much more engaged in, but brand ambassadorship that to some degree in golf or in surfing, like skateboarding, that stuff's been happening for a long time too. That's never been publicized in a big way. It's not gotten a lot of attention, but kids have had deals and some of them have probably been female. So when you look and say, hey, like that growth and what a female student or a female athlete at a minor age, what she is going to be able to learn skill-wise, see others do, develop about her personality, so that when she gets to college in the future, like the next generations are going to be that much more advantaged to maximize their opportunity. And I think it's going to be one of the most fascinating, cool things to watch. And on top of the fact that they have a lot going for them outside of the sport on top of it. So
if Iowa makes the Final Four in women's this year, I think the price of admission will probably be quadruple ticket value. I think it's a safe bet based on what happened last year. If it's an Iowa, LSU, South Carolina kind of thing like it was last year, that is what's going to change it. Is when you can show market force, and that's what women's sports is doing for the first time. You mentioned Nebraska. I don't know if you guys, I mean, Google it. It's insane to see. They put a volleyball court in the middle of Husker Stadium is roughly as big as, or Memorial's is roughly as big as this one. That's what's going to change things. And the fact that that's happening now, that's something that I never thought I'd see. Because I think we were all sort of
resigned.
Resigned. I wouldn't say convinced, but resigned to that narrative of like, well,
disparity.
Nobody cares because nobody shows up.
Right.
That's like if you put a little investment in something, it's amazing to see what can happen.
All right, so our closing question. A lot has changed within the last 5 years across college athletics. What do you see college athletics looking like 5 years from now?
5 years from now.
We can start with whoever's ready.
2024, 2029. Roughly the same.
Yeah, I think it's going to depend on the media shift and contracts. I think we're going to see quite a few media contracts expire over the next 5 years, and whether or not digital actually and streaming makes an inroad in those packages, I think is going to have a big say in what it looks like. Yeah.
It's y'all's fault because you keep consuming media different ways. No, I'm serious.
We can't find you.
You guys are watching games on your phone, you bunch of weirdos. Like that's part of it. Seriously, media executives are like, oh my God, what are the kids doing right now? How do we charge them for this? That's a huge thing. SEC I think goes up in 34. I think Big Ten's 36. I don't know if those numbers are right. You start negotiations quietly about 3 years before they go up. So that will be the next sea change in college athletics. So we have 5 years. I think you're gonna start seeing indicators. Things are gonna look roughly the same though.
I heard one time a conference was looking at their next network deal, and they were talking about it 10 years before it happened. So what's going to happen in the next 5 years is going to be, a growth out of where we are right now. I think potentially a lot can change because of mostly lawsuits. I think those are going to have a profound effect in the here and now very quickly. So I think college athletics, even in 5 years, could look already structurally very different and really set a path for how, hey, the next not only contracts look, they can move early or on some of those things if they have look-ins. So a lot of things could happen that are hanging out there in the balance right now, as it seems. But I think that's the attention, how everyone, keeps, golly, looking at college in general, just from an education standpoint, it's a whole nother, thing to look at. So I think it's going to be a lot that's going to happen. We used to say like 3 to 4 years when I worked in the licensing industry because of merchandise and buying patterns and retail stores. Right now it's like 2 to 3 months. You just wait a second, it's going to change in another way
That's true.
probably be more helpful. So.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. That's all the time we have. Look forward to our next panels coming up later today.
Thanks so much.